Oakhaven was not built upon history, it was suffocated by it. The small, isolated community existed in a perpetual twilight, its clapboard houses aging faster than their inhabitants, eternally coated in the gray damp that blew in from the surrounding forest. This pervasive chill was not merely meteorological, it was spiritual, steeped in the local obsession with nameless graves and an ancient, territorial curse. The townsfolk moved with a cautious, head-down rhythm, their conversations punctuated by uneasy silence whenever the subject drifted toward the west, toward the perpetually rotting boundaries of the Wailing Mire. Elias Thorne, however, saw none of the romance in this communal dread. To him, the fear was a quantifiable sociological illness, a cascade failure of rational thought passed down through generations. He was a man defined by sharp edges and clinical detachment, a devotee of the verifiable, the observable, and the absolute laws of physics. Elias's intellect was his fortress, and his current expedition was his crusade. He had brought his friends, Marcus, Dean, and Noah, deep into this forgotten corner of the state not for adventure, but for definitive proof. Proof that the town's crippling anxiety was merely folklore sustained by poor education and amplified acoustics. The central conflict was drawn not between men, but between methodologies, Elias's rigid, unyielding commitment to science, and the pervasive, emotionally charged power of the local myth. He found the town's reliance on fetishes and impromptu roadside shrines insulting to human capacity. He had spent months dissecting their stories, seeking geological anomalies or unusual wind patterns that could account for the rumored sounds. His conclusion remained firm. They heard what they were conditioned to hear. But the history of the mire was dark enough to resist logical deconstruction. Local lore insisted that the swamp was not a natural depression but a geographical wound, opened by divine wrath centuries ago. The Wailing Mire was the site of the infamous settlers' treachery. When the first European families pushed into the territory, they entered a fragile, hard-won pact with the indigenous people, exchanging manufactured tools for safe passage and land use. The peace lasted barely a season before the settlers, driven by greed and the discovery of rumored mineral deposits, massacred the encampment. The chieftain, a powerful shaman whose name was now whispered only in fragmented syllables, was the last to fall. As the life drained out of him, he did not cry out for mercy, but invoked a curse of such profound malice that the earth itself seemed to recoil. He called upon the spirits of the deep earth and the tormented wind to merge his eternal suffering with the land, decreeing that the invaders and all their descendants would know no peace within the shadow of the Blackwood County pines. The Mire-Shade was born of this vengeance. It was said to be the elemental embodiment of the chieftain's final, silent suffering. Witnesses, those who lived long enough to tell, described it not as a ghost, but as a living piece of the swamp, impossibly tall, clad in skin the texture and color of obsidian bark, with roots twisting where hair should be, and eyes that burned with the deep, angry red of congealed blood. But the most terrifying feature was its head, perpetually wrenched backward upon its shoulders, and its mouth, a vast, tattered void like a trumpet molded from ruptured flesh. The Mire-Shade did not hunt with claws or teeth, but with sound. The locals called it the shriek of annihilation. They believed it was the concentrated essence of the chieftain's rage, a sound so unnatural, so perfectly tuned to the molecular resonance of flesh, that it did not simply frighten or deafen, it unmade. They spoke of people dissolving, of bone turning to dust, of matter rejecting its own structure under the pressure of the vengeful spiritual force. The Mire-Shade was not seeking to kill, it was seeking to utterly erase any trace of the bloodline that had crossed the original pact. For Elias, the complexity of the legend was merely a testament to the human imagination under duress. That such detailed, physically impossible effects could be attributed to a sound wave was ludicrous. This weekend, camping deep within the officially condemned zone of the Wailing Mire, represented his final, definitive statement. He had gathered his equipment, decibel meters, infrasound detectors, geological survey tools, and high-definition cameras. He was going to spend 3 nights capturing every vibration, every rustle, every supposed spectral moan, and prove that there was nothing there but science, wind, and the inevitable decay of nature. They were driving toward the edge now, the asphalt dissolving into rutted, muddy track. Marcus, always the jester, was cracking crude jokes, masking his own nervousness with bravado. Dean, the muscle of the group, looked increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward the encroaching shadows. Only Noah, the quietest and most sensitive, remained stone-faced, staring straight ahead as if trying to physically suppress the surrounding dread with his gaze. "A few more miles, gentlemen," Elias announced, his voice clipped and overly cheerful, betraying the slight thrill he felt at challenging the absurd. "A weekend of damp clothing, canned beans, and the systematic dismantling of a 300-year-old fear paradigm." He patted the dashboard, feeling a fierce satisfaction. This trip was his opportunity to excise the root of superstition not just from Oak Haven, but from his own philosophical landscape. He would bring back data, cold and undeniable, and silence the whispers that claimed this land belonged to something older, darker, and infinitely more patient than humanity. The boundary was close, marked only by a decaying wooden sign, barely visible beneath a curtain of Spanish moss. "Keep out. Penalty of trespass is absolute." Elias smiled. Absolutes, he knew, belonged only to the observable universe. They were about to enter the domain of the unproven, and he intended to leave it completely empty. The metal chain stretched taut across the logging path had been rusty enough to bleed orange onto Dean's knuckles as he yanked it down. Beside it, the warning sign, bolted crookedly to a sickly white birch, was a masterpiece of primitive fear, faded paint depicting a figure neither human nor beast, captioned by crude block letters that warned against the Wailing Mire and the Shade's grasp. The wind, surprisingly warm, ruffled the frayed edges of the wood. Marcus, always the jester, posed dramatically next to the sign, mimicking the contorted shape of the depicted monster. "Behold Elias, the terrifying Mire-Shade," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the densely packed pines. "I feel the spectral chill of impending debt collection." Elias Thorne, seated comfortably in the passenger seat of their battered SUV, offered a condescending smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His sense of validation was intoxicating. This entire trip, this elaborate, expensive endeavor, was his final, definitive statement on the nature of fear, a controlled experiment proving the efficacy of mass delusion. "Careful, Marcus," Elias replied, leaning back and watching the others with an anthropologist's detachment. "You might violate the ancient tribal ordinances of the forest rangers." Dean kicked the rotting wood post the sign was attached to. "No ordinances, just ignorance, Elias. You win. We're deep enough into Blackwood County that the air smells like fear and pine needles, and all we've seen is a misplaced deer track." They had entered the zone. The moment the tires rolled over the last discernible layer of gravel and onto the packed, damp earth of the Mire's boundary, an immediate shift in atmosphere occurred. It wasn't a dramatic change, it was subtle, psychological. The surrounding forest, moments ago a standard, if dense, New England wilderness, seemed to swallow the sound of their engine. The Wailing Mire, Elias noted clinically, had been unfairly maligned. By day, it was breathtakingly beautiful, possessing a sinister, curated charm. Sunlight, filtered through an impossibly high and thick canopy of century-old oaks and cypress, was fragmented into mosaics of gold and emerald that danced on the spongy ground. The air was rich and heavy, bearing the complex scent of decay, blooming fungus, and the deep, fertile moisture of the peat bog. It was the smell of life thriving in rot, a place that felt perpetually in the late autumn, even in the middle of summer. This beauty, however, was treacherous. The ground was uneven, deceptive pockets of brackish water hidden beneath a deceptive blanket of moss. It forced the group to slow their pace, transforming their journey from a cocky excursion into a deliberate, grinding penetration. Noah, the quietest member of the quartet, and perhaps the least enthusiastic about the venture, kept scanning the tree-line. He wasn't afraid of the legend, he was afraid of the place. "It's too quiet," Noah murmured, his hand resting near the gear shift. "Even for deep woods. Where are the birds?" "Birds follow food, Noah, not arbitrary property lines," Elias corrected gently, but with firm academic authority. "The mire is an ecosystem of low biodiversity. Besides, noise pollution is probably why the locals invented the Mire-Shade. They needed an explanation for the silence. Elias felt a surge of professional satisfaction. He was here, where rational thought supposedly dissolved, proving that even the most deeply ingrained superstition could not withstand the presence of a few college-educated men armed with facts and a fully stocked cooler. He had intended to film and record everything, proving that any alleged phenomena was either infrasound, wind shear, or localized auditory hallucination induced by extreme stress. After nearly 2 hours of slow driving along what felt less like a road and more like a barely maintained scar in the earth, they reached their destination. The cabin was exactly as described in the county records, abandoned since 1953, swallowed by the slow, damp process of reclamation. It stood on a slight rise, surrounded by skeletal gray trunks of long-dead trees, overlooking a deeper, darker section of the bog. The wood was silvered and soft with rot. The windows were gaping black eyes. It was utterly, perfectly isolated. Home sweet home. Dean whistled, pulling the heavy bags of provisions from the trunk. If the Mire-Shade is real, I think it's living in the basement. Elias loved the cabin. Its decay symbolized the slow, inevitable failure of humanity's brief dominance over nature. And its location underscored the total commitment to the isolation necessary for their experiment. They spent the late afternoon establishing camp. They cleared debris, boarded up the most exposed windows with plywood they had brought, and stacked firewood. The collective effort reinforced their initial, misplaced optimism. They were conquering the space, turning the supposedly haunted ground into a base of operations. As twilight bled across the sky, casting long, purple shadows that stretched like grasping fingers, they built a massive fire outside the cabin door. The flames roared, providing a comforting, artificial warmth and light, the ancient symbols of human defense against the unknown. The evening was loud, fueled by cheap whiskey and adrenaline. Marcus regaled them with ghost stories, ironically adopting the voice of a panicked villager, while Dean kept the jokes coming. Elias, drinking sparingly, maintained his role as the detached observer, occasionally interjecting with a debunking lecture on historical paranoia or cognitive bias. "See, gentlemen," Elias declared, swirling the lukewarm liquid in his plastic cup, the firelight making his face look momentarily zealous. "The fear isn't out there. It's here." He tapped his temple. "It's the cultural residue of generations who didn't understand meteorology or neurology. We are surrounded by deep, primordial darkness, and yet, what is the loudest sound? Our laughter. The true lesson of the mire is that reason always wins." He felt satisfied. The first leg of the journey, the psychological penetration, was complete. They were confident, slightly drunk, and utterly untouched. The Mire-Shade had failed to appear. But as the whiskey wore down, and the fire began to settle into a bed of glowing embers, the mood shifted. It wasn't a gradual transition into night. It was instantaneous and brutal. One moment there was the low, comforting crackle of the fire and the residual hum of their own conversation. The next, the entire forest snapped into absolute, smothering silence. The stars above were impossibly bright, millions of pinpricks of light that only emphasized the total lack of illumination below the canopy. The heat radiating from the dying fire seemed to rise uselessly straight up, and the air around them dropped several degrees in a single, shivering pulse. The silence that descended was not the quiet of nature resting. It was the silence of a packed room holding its breath, waiting for a cue. Dean cleared his throat, the small, wet sound echoing like a gunshot. "Okay," he muttered, pulling his jacket tighter. "That's unnerving." Marcus, who had been about to tell another joke, simply stared into the darkness beyond the ring of light. Even his irreverence seemed to be draining out of him. Elias felt the change too, but he instinctively fought it with categorization. Localized thermal inversion, affecting ambient sound travel. He repeated the phrase internally, a mantra against the primitive dread that was starting to seep into his bloodstream. Yet the cold was wrong. It wasn't the natural bite of the wilderness. It was deep, penetrating, and dry, carrying no scent of frost or water vapor. It felt like the absence of heat, the chilling touch of a vacuum. It was the kind of cold that seemed to come not from the atmosphere, but from the inside of his bones. He glanced at his friends, seeing their faces now etched with genuine, though unspoken, alarm in the meager firelight. The initial euphoria of the night had vanished, replaced by the heavy realization of their deep, profound isolation. They were miles past the boundary of reason, sitting in a black pit of forgotten things. Elias forced himself to smile, but it felt stiff, like cracking wood. "Right," he said, standing up a little too quickly. "We should secure the remaining food. I'm going to grab a few more large logs from the pile by the eastern ridge. Don't worry, gentlemen. It's just the woods." He picked up a flashlight, its beam a meager, trembling yellow spear against the ocean of blackness, and stepped out of the comforting circle of the firelight. He needed to prove, for himself now more than for them, that the silence was meaningless. He needed to walk into the dark and return unharmed, reinforcing the failed hypothesis of the Mire-Shade. But as he moved away from the fire, the chilling presence intensified, pressing against him like thick, invisible water. And in the absolute, unnatural quiet of the mire, Elias Thorne, the steadfast servant of science, took his first step into the realm of pure, inescapable fear. The fire, which had roared with defiant warmth only an hour earlier, now seemed a pathetic, flickering heart struggling against the massive, encroaching blackness. Elias watched Marcus and Dean still joking, their voices unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness of the mire. Even the normally volatile Marcus was subdued, keeping his gaze locked on the dancing flames. Noah, the quietest of the group, stared into the perimeter shadows, his hand resting instinctively on the rusty hunting knife he'd brought. "I'm going to grab more fuel," Elias announced, trying to inject authority into his tone. He needed a few minutes alone, a chance to walk the edge of the darkness and prove to himself that the oppressive cold wasn't supernatural, that the silence wasn't a deliberate predator. It was the last, desperate stand of his certainty. Marcus shrugged. "Don't wander into the bog, Professor. We don't want to have to explain to the coroner that you were swallowed by a local legend." Elias offered a curt nod, snatching his heavy-duty flashlight. He walked purposefully away from the firelight's meager protection, the woods immediately swallowing the warmth and the sound of his friends' distant conversation. The air shifted, becoming thick and viscous, smelling overwhelmingly of decay, stagnant water, and something metallic, like old, drying blood mixed with moss. He moved past the perimeter of their campsite, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the ancient, gnarled trees, which seemed to lean in like conspirators. He told himself the cold was just a localized cold front, the silence just a natural consequence of dense insulation, the metallic smell just iron-rich soil. He lectured the darkness internally, listing scientific reasons for every creeping sensation. He stopped at a cluster of fallen pine branches, lifting his light higher to assess the hall. That was when the lecture ended. Not a sound, not a leaf crunching, not a breath of wind, but he knew he was no longer alone. The pressure in the atmosphere intensified, feeling less like weather and more like the compression of a massive weight. Elias slowly turned the beam of his flashlight to his right. It was standing there, perhaps 20 feet away, partially obscured by the shadow of an ancient cedar, yet impossible to mistake for anything natural. It defied geometry and biology. It was the Mire-Shade. Its height was terrifying, easily twice the size of a man, and its body was impossibly gaunt, defined by jagged, elongated lines. The skin wasn't flesh, but a dark, matte substance, like volcanic obsidian perpetually wet with swamp water. Where hair should have been, there was a tangled, dense mass of thick, black roots and vines, twisting around the crown of its head and dangling down its back like the veil of a weeping willow, dripping cold, black ooze. Elias's flashlight beam trembled violently as he tracked its most horrific features. The Mire-Shade's head was wrenched fully backward upon its shoulders, defying all musculoskeletal constraints. It stared at him, its profile reversed, creating a dizzying impression of permanent, profound agony. But it was the eyes that held him captive. They were deep cavities filled not with pupils or irises, but with pulsating, molten light, a terrifying red, the color of blood freshly spilled onto black velvet. Then there was the mouth. It was not a mouth built for speech or sustenance, but for atrocity. It was ripped impossibly wide, stretching from the angle of one jawbone to the other, a vast, jagged fissure that opened and closed with an unnerving, mechanical slowness. The inner cavity was layered with cartilage and ridges, turning the creature's maw into a distorted, natural trumpet, a biological weapon crafted only for the delivery of annihilation. Elias tried to scream, but his throat seized, only producing a ragged, wet gasp that was instantly swallowed by the absolute silence. He was rooted to the spot, his rational mind entirely overridden by the primeval terror that flooded his system. He didn't just see a monster, he saw the embodiment of the local curse, the proof of the legend he had spent his life mocking. The Mire-Shade didn't move towards him. It didn't need to. It simply tilted its impossibly reversed head, and its massive, ruined maw slowly began to widen further, gathering the vast, suffocating silence of the mire into its terrible structure. A second before the attack, Elias experienced a profound, metaphysical dread, the intuitive knowledge that the sound about to be released was not meant for the ear, but for the fundamental structure of his being. Then it hit. It wasn't a noise, it was a physical force, a tearing of the dimensional fabric that comprised sound. The blast didn't travel through the air, it traveled through his bone marrow, through the fluid in his spine, striking his inner ear and skull with the force of an industrial press. The sound was an impossible synthesis, the high, relentless scream of 1,000 souls being dragged through broken glass, overlaid with the deep, guttural bass of the Earth's tectonic plates shifting, all compressed into a single, white-hot point of auditory pain. Elias collapsed, dropping the flashlight. The world became a kaleidoscope of flashing red agony. He felt his teeth rattle, his eyeballs vibrate uncontrollably, and a searing pain erupted from his ears. He wasn't hearing sound. His very molecular structure was vibrating in violent opposition to itself. The air around him seemed to thicken into hot, pulsing jelly. He tasted iron and bile. The sound wave was targeted, localized, brutal. It lasted for perhaps 3 seconds, but in that duration, it felt like an eternity of continuous, high-frequency torture designed to dismantle his mind layer by layer. And then, as abruptly as it began, it was gone. Silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence, ringing, metallic, and heavy with the aftershock of violence. Elias lay whimpering on the damp earth, clutching his head. He tried to focus, but the world swam. He pushed himself onto all fours, coughing violently, dragging ragged breaths into his burning lungs. When he cautiously touched his right ear, his fingers came away slick with warm, sticky blood. He scrambled for his flashlight, finding it buried in the moss. He shone the beam toward where the creature had stood. Nothing. The Mire-Shade was gone, vanished back into the primordial shadows as if it had been a hallucination summoned purely by the darkness. But the blood, the agonizing, splitting headache, the taste of copper, those were real. The fear was real. The certainty that he had faced the manifestation of pure malice was now the most irrefutable fact of his existence. Driven by panic, Elias abandoned the firewood and staggered back toward the distant, wavering orange glow of the firelight. He ran like a madman, tripping over roots, ignoring the searing pain in his arm where he had scraped against the bark. He burst back into the light, stumbling past the ring of logs and collapsing onto the ground near Dean and Marcus. "Elias! What the hell?" Marcus yelled, jumping back. "You look like you saw a ghost. What happened to your ear?" Elias scrambled backward, his eyes wide and fixed on the perimeter shadows, waiting for the return of the impossibly twisted head and the trumpet mouth. It was there," Elias choked out, his voice hoarse and high-pitched. "The Mire-Shade. It screamed." Dean and Noah looked at each other, confused. "Screamed what? A raccoon?" Dean asked, trying to sound jovial, though his eyes darted nervously. "You must have fallen and hit your head, man. Your ears are bleeding." "No! Don't you understand?" Elias gripped Marcus's knee, his bloody hand staining the denim. "It was the scream. The sound of the curse. It was right there, 20 feet away. The force, it almost shattered my skull. Didn't you hear it? Marcus pulled his leg away, his face hardening with frustration and a flash of deep concern. Hear what, Elias? We didn't hear anything but you crashing through the undergrowth. Not a damned peep. Look, maybe you need to sit down. You're in shock. The words struck Elias with a final, devastating blow, freezing the frantic energy in his chest. We didn't hear anything. The horror was no longer the Mire-Shade's existence, but the nature of its attack. It was not a physical threat confined by the laws of physics or sound waves. It was spiritual, targeted, and intensely personal. The creature hadn't used a physical attack to kill him. It had launched an assault directly against his skepticism, an internal detonation meant only for the man who believed in nothing. Elias Thorne, the paragon of reasoned science, the man who had journeyed into the darkness to prove its emptiness, now stared at the truth of his absolute defeat. The curse was real, and the beast had just given him a terrifying, private preview of its power, ensuring that the remaining time he had would be spent in the exquisite torture of dread, waiting for the true, final sound. Elias Thorne gripped the edge of the splintered wooden table, his knuckles white, the wood digging painfully into his palms. He felt the residual vibration of the scream not in his ears, which registered only the normal, if oppressive, quiet of the cabin, but deep within his bone marrow. He had checked his ears repeatedly in the dim lamplight, searching for burst capillaries, a trickle of blood, anything tangible to validate the catastrophe his mind had just endured. There was nothing. His ears were physically fine, which only deepened the terror. The devastation had been strictly metaphysical. He paced the small, dirt-floored cabin, a caged animal desperately pawing at the bars of reality. He tried to rebuild the foundations that had just been explosively dismantled. Auditory hallucination. Tinnitus due to extreme stress. Pressure-induced anomaly. He threw the terms against the wall of his fear, but they bounced back, hollow and meaningless. He knew, with a certainty that defied every doctorate and peer-reviewed paper he had ever published, that he had been standing 5 feet from a creature of pure, destructive malevolence, and it had targeted him with a sound wave that existed outside the known laws of physics. Seriously, Thorne, you look like you just saw a ghost ride a bicycle. Marcus drawled from his spot by the struggling fire, sipping tepid coffee. Relax, man. We're deep in the Blackwood. The silence gets to everyone. It's called nature. Elias stopped abruptly, the floor creaking under his worn boots. It wasn't silence, Marcus. It was an absence. And then, a frequency. Something that felt like the inside of my head being boiled. Dean chuckled, running a cleaning cloth over the lens of his expensive camera. Boiled heads? Look, Elias, we know this trip is about proving a point, but maybe the point you've proven is that you're under too much pressure. Did you sleep last night? The casual dismissal was a physical blow. They hadn't heard it. They hadn't felt the air pressurize and then violently collapse. They saw only the manic, sweaty face of their scientific leader, unraveling into raw superstition. No, you don't understand, Elias insisted, his voice rising, bordering on hysteria. I saw it. It was taller than the pines, coated in mud and shadow. And it screamed at me. Marcus sighed dramatically, setting down his mug. Fine. Let's say, purely hypothetically, you saw a giant mud monster. Why didn't we hear the scream that apparently broke the sound barrier? Elias had no answer, and the lack of a rational explanation was the thing that finally broke his composure. He sank onto a rough bench, running his hands over his face, feeling the grit of the ancient dust clinging to his skin. Only Noah, perched silently on his bunk in the far corner, offered any acknowledgement. He didn't speak, but his eyes, wide, dark, and reflecting the flickering light of the campfire, were fixed on Elias. There was no mockery in Noah's gaze, only a deep, shared, primordial terror. Noah wasn't doubting him. Noah was confirming the fear without violating the group's fragile veneer of rationality. The fire sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rough-hewn walls appear to shift and breathe. The initial atmosphere of the night had been one of deep, natural quiet, the kind that invites introspection. Now, as the hour deepened toward midnight, the quiet shifted into something else entirely, a stifling vacuum. It was an unnatural, perfect stillness. The low hum of insects that usually served as the background rhythm of the swamp was gone. The restless rustle of leaves was absent. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, its flames struggling against the oppression of the dead air. It was the silence before an ambush, the moment a predator holds its breath. Marcus, despite his skepticism, felt it too. He shifted uneasily, looking toward the dark, small window. Dean stopped cleaning his camera, his focus lost somewhere in the blackness outside the cabin door. "It got quiet," Dean mumbled, trying to sound casual, but the words were thin and nervous. "Really quiet. Atmospheric pressure change," Elias immediately recited, the reflex of the scientist kicking in before the terror could completely flood his senses. But the lie tasted like ash. He knew the truth: the Mire-Shade was close. It wasn't just existing in the swamp anymore, it was hunting. Then Elias heard it again. This time, it wasn't the soundless, spiritual attack. This was raw, physical sound, meant for the world. It was a slow, wet, grating sound, originating somewhere just beyond the eastern wall of the cabin. It was the noise of massive, densely packed root structures dragging through thick, saturated earth, a tearing, wrenching sound. Interspersed with the subterranean grinding was a noise that chilled Elias to his core, a long, drawn-out wrench, the sound of something impossibly large pulling itself free from a deep pocket of mire. It was the sound of a living creature, immense and hungry, deliberately moving. Elias snapped his head toward the sound. "It's moving," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. "It's hunting us." Marcus scowled, ready with another condescending retort, but then the sound came closer, clearer, and heavier. Sleuishrend. It was cyclical, rhythmic, and closing fast. Dean's hands trembled, dropping the lens cloth. He looked at Elias, the easy skepticism wiped clean from his face, replaced by dawning horror. "What is that?" Dean choked out, his eyes wide and glued to the cabin door. Elias had seen the creature's face. He had seen the gaping, twisted maw intended for only one purpose. He knew exactly what sound accompanied that slow, deliberate movement. "It's the shade," Elias said, his voice flat with certainty. "And it's no longer interested in just talking to me." The movement stopped directly outside the cabin. The silence returned, heavy and immediate, like a shroud dropped over the world. But this silence was the heaviest of all. It was the profound, expectant stillness of the moment before the strike. All four men were frozen, breathing shallowly, their ears straining against the absolute vacuum of the night. They were waiting for the sound that would inevitably confirm their doom. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a physical weight, thick and freezing, pressing the air out of the cabin. It coated the walls, smothered the feeble light of the lantern, and crept into the minds of the three men who huddled on the decaying floorboards. Elias had ceased his frantic pacing. He stood rigid, listening to the heavy, shallow breaths of his friends. Marcus sat with the shotgun across his knees, sweat gluing strands of hair to his forehead, his arrogant sneer finally wiped clean. Dean, ever the jittery one, was pale and shaking, muttering fragments of prayers he hadn't recited since childhood. Noah, meanwhile, remained curled in the corner, a statue of pure dread, his eyes wide and fixed on the grimy window that faced the swamp. "It's the quiet," Dean whispered, the sound cracking the oppressive silence like a pane of ice. "It's too quiet." "Nerves, Dean." Marcus tried to scoff, but the sound lacked conviction, dissolving instantly into the vast, sound-sucking vacuum outside. Elias knew better. The forest should breathe. There should be the rustle of nocturnal insects, the cry of an owl, the drip of condensate from the pines. But there was nothing. It was the absolute vacuum of the deep woods, the kind of silence that suggests everything capable of making noise has either fled or been consumed. He felt the cold deep in his bones, a metaphysical chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the feeling of being watched by something that existed solely to destroy. Then, the silence shattered. It wasn't a noise from outside, it was a sound from the inside, a heavy, wet thud against the rear wall of the cabin. It wasn't the impact of a falling tree or a large animal. It was deliberate, focused, and utterly overwhelming in its proximity. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and into their teeth. They froze, every eye snapping towards the flimsy wall. Dust motes danced in the lantern light above them, startled into motion. "What was that?" Dean's voice was high and thin. Before Elias could formulate a scientific possibility, a large, displaced rock, a falling branch, the answer arrived in the form of a rhythmic, dragging sound just outside the rear window, a noise like heavy, wet sackcloth being scraped over gravel. Slowly, relentlessly, the dragging progressed along the wall toward the front of the cabin where the largest window faced the path they had taken. Marcus lifted the shotgun, his hands trembling visibly. "Stay together," he hissed, but his voice was already lost to panic. The dragging stopped. A shadow fell across the front window, a shadow so vast, so dense, it seemed to swallow the meager ambient moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. It was a shadow that defied the laws of light, utterly opaque and absolute. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of sickly, blood-red light erupted outside. Two incandescent points of crimson appeared beyond the glass, fixed and unwavering, burning through the grime. The creature was here. It didn't hesitate. With a guttural roar that was more air rushing through a vast, ruined internal cavity than actual vocalization, the Mire-Shade smashed its colossal, root-like fist through the glass pane. The impact was deafening, the crash of glass, the splintering of the old wooden frame, and the immediate inrush of the swamp's ancient, sulfuric odor. The Mire-Shade stood revealed. It was even taller and more monstrous than Elias's hallucination, a terrifying fusion of necrotic flesh and black, polished obsidian. Its skin was taut and glistening, covered in patches of peat moss and the thin, pale roots of swamp flora. But what riveted them was its head, twisted at a grotesque angle, the roots of the swamp replacing hair, and the monstrous maw below the red eyes. It was a ruin of a face, ripped open into a horizontal cavity that resembled the bell of a broken, rusted French horn. Its arm, long, corded with sinew, and ending in fingers like sharpened roots, shot into the cabin. Its focus was immediate and absolute: Noah. Noah, who was frozen by the wall, the most isolated of the group. The creature's hand clamped around Noah's ankle with horrifying precision. Dean screamed, a high, futile noise instantly drowned out by the entity's own frantic, wheezing breathing. Marcus fumbled with the shotgun, trying desperately to level the heavy weapon, but he was too slow, paralyzed by the sheer, unholy scale of the horror before him. With a single, brutal tug, the Mire-Shade ripped Noah from the floor. Noah's head struck the wooden window frame, followed by a sickening sound of snapping bone and grinding cartilage, a sound that signaled the absolute, merciless strength of the predator. The creature pulled him halfway out, suspending his struggling body against the shattered window frame, the dark, humid air of the mire enveloping him. Noah's short, choked cries of terror were the last sounds of recognized humanity in the cabin. Then, the Mire-Shade prepared its weapon. It didn't need to inhale. It seemed to draw in the very atmosphere of the swamp, the fear, the decay, the ancient sorrow, and funnel it into that terrifying, trumpet-like maw. The crimson eyes flared, burning hotter than any furnace, and the creature's body tautened, every root and muscle fiber drawing tight like piano wire. Elias had time only for one thought, the terrifying, absolute surrender of his decades of rational belief: this is real. Then, the sound came. It was not merely a scream. It was the total, catastrophic rejection of the laws of physics, a wave of sonic destruction that hit the cabin with the force of a tactical missile. Elias felt it first in his chest. His lungs compressed violently, his heart seized, and the air was instantly sucked from his throat. Then it hit his ears. It was deafening beyond comprehension, far past the threshold of pain. It was the sound of a billion tormented souls screaming in unison while being simultaneously crushed beneath a collapsing mountain range. It was the sound of existence being undone. The sheer vibrational force was immediately destructive. The cabin shuddered violently, the foundation seeming to lift an inch off the muddy ground, only to crash back down. The lantern exploded, showering the room in flaming oil and plunging the interior into near total darkness, relieved only by the pulsing red glare from the monster's eyes. Elias collapsed, hands uselessly clamped over his already destroyed ears. He felt the blood begin to weep from his nose and ear canals, hot, viscous streams trickling over his fingers. His vision blurred not from tears, but from the physical agitation of his eyeballs within their sockets. His teeth vibrated so violently that he feared they would simply powderize inside his mouth. But the worst of the horror was directed outward, toward the struggling, trapped form of Noah. The sound wave struck Noah like a physical entity, a hammer of pure vibrational energy. The details were sickeningly clear, illuminated by the creature's hellish gaze. Noah didn't scream. He couldn't. The sound was too immediate, too penetrating. Elias watched, horrified, as the skin on Noah's back, exposed to the full, focused blast, began to ripple and tear. It wasn't lacerated by claws, it was peeled away by the frequency itself. Flesh boiled, then rapidly desiccated and shattered like clay. Muscle tissue underneath was not merely bruised, but violently shredded, torn away from the bone structure as if separated by a high-pressure jet of acid. Noah's spine, briefly visible in the monstrous light, vibrated uncontrollably, dissolving into a fine, bloody mist of bone fragments and cartilage. His body was rejecting itself, being dismantled at the molecular level by the sheer pressure of acoustic energy. The scream lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but in that eternity, Noah ceased to exist as a coherent physical form. He simply collapsed, a ruin of shredded fibers and broken tissue, utterly mutilated and unrecognizable, an unholy offering to the swamp's ancient malice. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound cut out. The resulting silence was a catastrophic vacuum, ringing with the high-pitched shriek of ruptured eardrums. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, the sharp scent of ozone, and the overwhelming stench of decay. Marcus and Dean were on their knees, retching violently, clutching their heads. Elias was gasping, struggling to force air into his burning lungs. For a moment, nothing moved except the trembling of their bodies. The creature's red eyes shifted slightly, moving from the remains of Noah to the survivors huddled inside. It emitted a low, wet, clicking sound, a sound of satisfaction, of hunting focus. "Run! Run!" Marcus shrieked, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the ringing in Elias's ears. Instinct, raw and animalistic, took over. Logic was dead. Science was a betrayal. The rational world had been obliterated by the force of a mythical entity. Elias scrambled blindly toward the front door, the remains of his previous certainty dissolving into terror. He didn't care about Marcus, or Dean, or the keys to the SUV. He cared only about putting distance between his fragile, physical body and the source of the annihilation. He burst through the rotting wooden door, Dean close behind him, followed by Marcus, who was still gripping the useless shotgun. They tumbled down the short porch steps and into the thick, freezing mud of the Wailing Mire path. The ancient fear of Oakhaven, the ridiculous superstition he had come here to disprove, was now chasing him, tangible, visible, and drenched in the blood of his friend. They ran, deafened, bleeding, and shattered, not looking back at the obsidian shape already tearing itself free of the window frame to pursue its remaining prey. Elias slammed his body weight against the accelerator, the engine catching with a strained, agonizing cough. The thick clay of the mire, churned by centuries of damp rot and the recent scuffle, fought every inch of the tire's rotation. The headlights cut uselessly through the heavy, oppressive blackness, illuminating only the immediate, desperate ring of trees. Marcus was screaming something incoherent, clutching the gaping wound on his arm where splinters had torn him, while Dean, breathing in ragged gasps, was trying to wipe the spray of Noah's blood from his face. Elias didn't look at them. He couldn't. He stared only at the road, a muddy rut that seemed to be closing in on itself. "Hold on!" Elias yelled, his voice raw, unrecognizable. He wrenched the steering wheel, and the SUV finally found purchase, lunging forward with a violent jolt. They were moving, fast and recklessly, careening past the skeletal husks of old pines. The movement brought a terrible, fleeting sense of victory. They had escaped the cabin, they had escaped the sound. Maybe, just maybe, if he drove fast enough, if he broke the boundary of Blackwood County, the laws of physics would reassert themselves. The Mire-Shade was myth, it couldn't keep pace with internal combustion. He gripped the wheel until his knuckles were white, focusing on the blinding speed, the rattling dashboard, the one physical truth he still possessed: velocity. Then came the silence. It wasn't the silence of the forest, which they had violated with the screaming engine. It was an unnatural, absolute cessation of wind and insect noise. It was the sound barrier being broken, the world holding its breath. Elias checked the rearview mirror, his heart collapsing into a hollow cavity of ice. It wasn't running. The Mire-Shade was gliding. It moved with a smooth, terrifying momentum, a dark shape barely discernible against the moonless landscape, covering ground as if gravity were a suggestion. It was gaining on them, not incrementally, but exponentially. "It's right behind us!" Dean shrieked, twisting around. Elias pressed the pedal harder, the SUV protesting, rattling apart over the ruts. He tried to calculate the distance, tried to find the Newtonian equation that explained how a mass of dried mud and shadow could move faster than 40 miles per hour. There was none. The sight alone was enough to break the rest of his fragile grasp on sanity. In the next terrifying second, the dark shape launched itself. It wasn't a leap, it was an upward liquid surge. It landed on the roof of the SUV with the weight of a dropped boulder, followed by a metallic shriek of tortured sheet metal collapsing inward. The noise was immense, deafening, and absolute. "Get it off! Get it off!" Marcus bellowed, trying desperately to roll down the window, a pointless gesture. The creature's weight shifted, grinding against the structure, and the world outside the front windshield warped into a jagged reflection of night. Elias swerved wildly, trying to throw the weight, but the Mire-Shade seemed to adhere to the car like a nightmare limpet mine. Then, a tearing sound, like wet cloth being ripped from dry bone. A thick, root-like limb, black as obsidian and tipped with a splintered claw, plunged through the center of the windshield directly in front of Dean. The safety glass spiderwebbed, then exploded inward in a shower of lethal fragments. Dean didn't even have time to register the pain. The limb, moving with brutal, blinding speed, didn't strike to wound, it struck to obliterate. It tore through Dean's skull with a sickening, wet crunch, twisting his head violently sideways against the headrest before ripping it free from the seat. Elias felt the spray of hot, viscous blood, bone fragments, and cerebral matter engulf the dashboard and the side of his face, momentarily blinding him. The scream that tore from Marcus's throat was not human. It was the sound of a terrified animal witnessing the violation of its own species. The Mire-Shade pulled its limb back, withdrawing Dean's inert body into the darkness outside. The gap in the windshield was jagged and yawning, allowing the creature's chilling, earthy stench to flood the cabin. Blinded and steering by instinct alone, Elias realized he was no longer driving on the road. The tires were spinning uselessly in the deep mud bordering the treeline. He fought the wheel, trying to regain control, but the combination of the slick ground, the paralyzing terror, and the creature's immense, shifting weight on the roof was too much. With a grinding, sickening finality, the SUV hydroplaned sideways and slammed violently into the massive, unyielding trunk of an ancient white oak. The impact was bone-jarring. Airbags deployed with explosions of acrid dust, crushing Elias against the seatbelt harness. The world dissolved into a ringing silence, punctuated only by the dripping sound of fluid and blood. Elias hung there, momentarily suspended between life and death, consciousness and catatonia. His ear buzzed, his ribs screamed, but he was alive. "Marcus!" he croaked, his voice thick with the taste of copper and dust. Marcus was slumped against the passenger door, gasping, but moving. He kicked open his door, which groaned on broken hinges. "We have to run," Marcus whispered, his eyes wide and vacant, staring past Elias at the jagged hole in the windshield. It's coming! Elias scrambled free, crawling out of the driver's side, tasting the cold night air that smelled of ozone and death. The Mire-Shade was already detaching itself from the destroyed vehicle. It dropped soundlessly to the ground, its colossal frame filling the space between the trees, a silhouette of vengeance. Split up! Marcus screamed, shoving Elias hard toward the deeper woods to the left. It can't get both of us at once! Marcus didn't wait for a reply. He bolted into the dense, thorny undergrowth on the right, his panic driving him with desperate, unnatural speed. Elias hesitated for a single, agonizing moment, staring at the Mire-Shade, whose head was now twisting toward Marcus's retreating form. Elias had always prided himself on his ability to calculate risks, to choose the optimal path. Now, the logical part of his brain was a smoldering ruin. Survival was pure reflex. He plunged into the woods opposite Marcus, ignoring the tearing pain in his shoulder and the deep lacerations on his face. He didn't run far. He didn't have the energy, or the conviction. He only ran until the density of the brush shielded him from immediate view, then he collapsed behind a fallen log, his chest heaving, listening to the cacophony of his own heartbeat trying to drown out the night. The chaos lasted only seconds. The rustling of Marcus's desperate escape was abruptly, brutally punctuated by an entirely different sound. It was not the world-shattering blast that had pulverized Noah. This time, the sound was contained, sharp, and focused, like a final, desperate sigh of the earth itself. It was Marcus's scream. It was cut short mid-note, a thin, high-pitched cry of pure terror that was instantly swallowed by a horrible, wet tearing noise, the sound of tissue yielding to immense, brutal force, followed by a heavy, grinding sigh from the creature. And then, nothing. Absolute silence descended upon the Blackwood County forest once more. This was not the peaceful silence of the wilderness. It was the suffocating, heavy blanket of the predator finishing its meal. Elias lay motionless behind the log, tasting the dirt, the remnants of Dean's blood drying on his cheek. The rationalist was dead. Elias Thorne, the man who believed only in the measurable universe, was gone. What remained was a shivering, hollow vessel, utterly alone, utterly exposed, and hunted by a creature that was the physical embodiment of every nightmare he had ever dismissed. The Mire-Shade did not follow Marcus's death with the devastating sound. It took its time, savoring the silence, emphasizing the finality. Elias could hear the wet, heavy sounds of the creature moving through the underbrush, not in pursuit, but simply repositioning. He was the last one. And the Mire-Shade knew exactly where he was. The forest had become its cathedral, and Elias was the final sacrifice. His only chance lay back in the metal wreck, the only object that was not purely organic and might offer a minute, technological advantage. The engine. If he could reach the engine. Elias shoved the key into the ignition again. It ground, a sickening, defeated sound of metal weeping, then nothing. He slammed his forehead against the steering wheel, the sharp pain nothing compared to the roaring void where his logic used to reside. The silence outside was complete, thick, and demanding. Gasoline fumes mixed with the metallic tang of his own blood and the visceral scent of what had been Dean and Noah. The SUV was his tomb, a crumpled cage of steel and shattered idealism. He tried again, twisting the key, praying to a god he'd spent his life systematically denying. The engine gave a pitiful cough, a final, wet gasp, and died. It was in that absolute silence, while his lungs fought for air that didn't smell like fear, that the air changed again. It didn't just grow cold, it became still, heavy, like wading through molasses. The broken tree branches stopped their gentle sway. The wind vanished. This was the stillness of the predator approaching the kill. He didn't need to see it to know it was there. His rational brain, now nothing more than a screaming child strapped inside a lunatic's mind, registered only the terrifying shift in atmospheric pressure. But then he saw the shadow. It moved from the deep, impenetrable blackness of the forest floor, gliding, not running, into the weak, filtering moonlight cast by the clearing. It was immense, a towering distortion of humanoid form. Mire-Shade stopped directly outside the driver's side, its obsidian skin slick with the mire and perhaps the drying blood of his friends. Its head, still angled impossibly backward, cocked slightly, as if evaluating the fragility of the remaining metal that shielded Elias. It didn't need the grand entrance. Its mere presence was the sound of the world ending. Elias backed up, pressing his spine into the shattered seat, trying to become one with the wreckage. The driver's side window was gone, replaced by jagged shards clinging to the rubber frame. He watched as the creature raised a hand, a mass of thick, root-like tendrils bound by black, calcified mud. The hand struck the car door. It was not a punch, but a pressurized blow, the sound of metal yielding completely. The door buckled inward, groaning like a dying beast. Mire-Shade pressed harder, the remaining steel protesting loudly before tearing away from the hinges. Elias instinctively threw his left arm up to protect his face. The creature's appendage shot through the gap, wrapping around his forearm. The grip was immediate and crushing. It wasn't the grasp of muscle, but of geological pressure. Elias felt the bone in his radius splinter before the pain even registered. He screamed, a thin, meaningless sound compared to the horrors he had witnessed. He kicked desperately, his feet finding purchase on the dashboard, trying to leverage his body against the overwhelming pull. Mire-Shade was drawing him out, easily, relentlessly, treating him like a doll being extracted from a toy box. The jagged edges of the broken door frame sliced into his ribs and sighed as he was dragged toward the opening. He saw the eyes, twin coals of burning hatred, fixed on him. "No, no, please!" he choked, the words catching on the blood in his throat. The creature ignored the plea, pulling him further. Elias's arm felt like it was being separated from his shoulder socket. He was halfway out, pinned between the twisted metal and the crushing grip, his head hanging down toward the muddy ground. Mire-Shade raised its inverted head higher, positioning its trumpet-like maw directly over Elias's exposed chest. The air grew infinitesimally dense, vibrating in anticipation. Elias could see the shimmering, heat-like effect emanating from the creature's throat. This was the culmination. This was the final note, the promise of the absolute sonic annihilation that had consumed Noah. He closed his eyes, bracing for the total disintegration of his existence, the end of all sound, all matter, all reason. The world went silent. But the scream did not come. Instead, the creature stopped. Elias felt the crushing pressure on his arm ease slightly, but the monster's grasp remained firm. He opened his eyes, blurred with pain and terror, and saw the impossible. Mire-Shade was shaking. It wasn't shaking with anticipation or rage, but with physical restraint. It was straining, its massive, dark form vibrating, its roots digging deep into the mud surrounding the wrecked SUV. The fiery coals of its eyes flickered, showing confusion and profound, ancient frustration. Mire-Shade roared, but it was not the sonic weapon. It was a guttural, wounded sound, a low, wet rumble of pure animalistic fury and inability. It was trying to step closer, to bring its mouth fully over Elias, but it couldn't. It was struggling against an invisible, adamantine wall. Elias could feel the invisible tension between the creature and the wreckage, like a stretched cable threatening to snap. Mire-Shade's rage intensified, its claws scrabbling uselessly against the air, yet it could not breach an unseen line perhaps only a foot in front of its chest. The monster pulled Elias's arm taut, stretching him to his limit, trying to drag his entire body across the threshold by brute force. But the moment Elias's torso threatened to leave the confined space of the vehicle's shadow, the tension tightened, and Mire-Shade instantly recoiled, groaning in what sounded like physical pain. Elias, momentarily forgotten by the creature's struggle against the unseen force, let his gaze wander. He followed the line of the crumpled bumper. The SUV had not simply hit a tree. It had wrapped itself around a gigantic, moss-covered white oak, a sentinel tree easily a century older than the settlement of Oak Haven itself. And at the base of the oak, half hidden by the debris of the crash and the rising damp, was a stone. It wasn't a natural fieldstone. It was flat, squared off, and covered in thick green lichen. But Elias saw the unmistakable etchings, deep, geometric cuts that time had almost erased. He had seen photos of these in the dusty local museum archives, dismissed them as artifacts of pagan superstition, and the baseless fears of the early settlers who stole this land. It was the boundary stone. The ancient, cursed boundary, marking the limits of the consecrated ground, the unholy line established by the tribe before their final, sorrowful dispersal. The spot where the retribution of the earth's spirits was meant to halt. The realization settled over Elias, colder and heavier than the fear of death. The creature was real. The monstrous, terrifying, impossible entity was unequivocally real. But the curse that birthed it, the vengeance that drove it, was bound by the rules of its creation. It was constrained by geography, trapped by the very metaphysical laws Elias Thorne had devoted his life to dismantling. Mire-Shade was pure, palpable evil, and yet it was a slave to a piece of carved stone. With a final, shattering roar of thwarted malice, the creature hurled Elias's ruined arm back into the car, releasing him completely. The force of the throw slammed him against the center console. Mire-Shade retreated 3 paces, its breathing ragged, staring at the invisible barrier with the burning, baffled hatred of a prisoner looking through iron bars. The shadow of the ancient oak and the weathered stone offered the only sanctity left on earth. Elias was safe. But the reason for his safety, the confirmation that the darkest superstitions of humanity held true and absolute power, fractured the last piece of sanity holding his mind together. He was alive, protected not by physics or chance, but by a very real, very defined, supernatural line in the mud. The hamlet of Oakhaven lay not merely under the shadow of the mountains but under the thick, suffocating blanket of its own history. It was a place where the dead felt closer than the living, where every patch of unkempt soil concealed a tragedy, and where the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, eternal hum of regret. The townsfolk were molded by this dread. They spoke in hushed tones of the unmarked graves outside the old county line, the resting places of settlers who had paid the ultimate price for their avarice, and of the inescapable curse they had incurred. They believed, deeply and fiercely, that the land held memory, and that memory demanded retribution. Elias Thorne, however, believed only in what he could measure. He was a scientist, a physicist whose professional certainty had seeped into his very soul, making him immune to the illogical infections of fear. To Elias, the tales of Oakhaven, the Wailing Mire, the spectral figures, the localized psychological disturbances, were merely fascinating case studies in mass hysteria and primitive coping mechanisms. He viewed the fear that gripped his friends, Marcus, Dean, and Noah, not with sympathy, but with an exasperated contempt, a dismissal of their weakness in the face of the empirically unverified. The central conflict of his life, Elias felt, was the enduring struggle between cold, hard fact and the comforting delusion of myth. And the myth haunting Oakhaven was the Mire-Shade. The legend, which Elias had meticulously documented and catalogued as folklore, described a betrayal centuries old. Early European settlers, starving and desperate, had made a pact with the local Native American tribe, led by a revered chieftain. They traded knowledge for safe passage and sanctuary. But once the settlers established their footing, bolstered by new supplies and a burgeoning greed for the swamp's hidden resources, they turned on their hosts. The chieftain and his people were massacred, their bodies submerged in the deepest part of the bog, what became known as the Wailing Mire. As the chieftain died, the legend claimed, he did not just curse the ground and the betrayers, he called upon the spiritual essence of the swamp itself. The Mire-Shade was the result, not a ghost, but a physical manifestation of ancient, agonizing sound, the materialized shriek of 1,000 tormented souls bound to the wet earth. They said its weapon was the sound of annihilation, a frequency capable of tearing flesh from bone and sanity from the mind. It was the eternal echo of divine judgment, a spiritual entity patrolling the perimeter of its sacred, violated land, demanding repayment in the coin of human suffering. Elias's plan for the weekend camping trip was the culmination of years of quiet superiority. This journey into the mire was his final, irrefutable experiment. He would set up his instruments, sound meters, thermal sensors, high-definition cameras, and prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the Mire-Shade was nothing more than a combination of wind through the cypress trees, the rustling of large animals, and the feverish imaginations of men already steeped in superstition. It was an intellectual cleansing, a definitive exorcism of irrationality, and he was eager to enjoy the smug satisfaction of watching his friends concede their baseless terror. This was not a trip for adventure, it was a pilgrimage to the altar of logic, and Elias Thorne intended to walk away the high priest of reason, leaving the demons of Oak Haven buried under a mountain of data. He packed his sound meters first, confident that his tools would defeat their terrors. He did not pack a flashlight, arguing that reliance on artificial light only heightened the psychological response to darkness. The old rusted sign that marked the official entrance to the Blackwood County Preserve, and unofficially, the perimeter of the Wailing Mire, was riddled with buckshot and peeling paint. Below the official warning, a crude, hand-painted symbol, a twisted circle resembling a gaping mouth, was scrawled, accompanied by the barely legible words, "Turn back. The mire is hungry." Marcus, a man whose bravado was inversely proportional to his actual courage, slammed the beat-up SUV to a halt. He laughed, a high, nervous sound, as Dean pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of the sign with a caption Elias knew would be aggressively ironic. "Look at this, Elias," Dean called back, still chuckling. "They're using Comic Sans level lettering for their threats. Are we sure this isn't just a very elaborate marketing campaign for a local haunted hayride?" Elias allowed himself a small, private smile, a pure expression of intellectual superiority. "The beauty of deep-seated local fear, gentlemen," he stated, adjusting his glasses. "It requires zero quality control. The narrative does all the heavy lifting." They drove past the boundary, and immediately, the environment shifted. The road dissolved into a muddy track, and the oppressive pine forests of the county gave way to the cypress and water oak of the swamp. It was deceptively beautiful. The air, thick with the smell of decay and sweet moss, felt heavy and warm, yet a perpetual twilight seemed to reign. Sunlight filtered through the dense, hanging Spanish moss and sickly yellow-green shards, illuminating pockets of stagnant, dark water. The Wailing Mire did not look terrifying. It looked ancient, quiet, and deeply indifferent. They found the dilapidated cabin exactly where the local maps had indicated, a rotting shell of wood and iron, nestled in a clearing perhaps half a mile from the main bog. The isolation was absolute. The silence, once the engine was cut, was so profound it hurt the ears. Even the usual sounds of the swamp, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, seemed muted, as if the local fauna had been warned to hold its breath. They spent the late afternoon establishing camp. Marcus and Dean gathered wood with loud, performative efficiency, occasionally shouting across the clearing to dispel the growing tension. Noah, the quietest of the group, moved with a visible reluctance, glancing frequently at the darkening tree line. As the sun finally dipped, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep scarlets, the campfire was lit. The flames provided a brief, comforting illusion of warmth and security. Elias sat slightly apart, calibrating his directional microphones. He felt a profound sense of vindication. Here they were, within the mythical grasp of the Mire-Shade, and the only detectable sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the nervous chatter of his friends. "All right, Elias," Dean slurred slightly, having already started on the cheap whiskey. "When do we expect the spectral chieftain to show up and demand we return his land deeds?" "I didn't bring a notary." Elias smirked. "Statistically, the highest incidence of reported sightings occurs between midnight and 3 a.m., correlated with rapid, localized drops in temperature and barometric pressure. But I predict tonight we will record nothing." His confidence was infectious, momentarily drawing the others out of their anxiety. They shared stories, their voices loud and defiant against the looming darkness. For an hour, they were just four friends enjoying a camping trip, their rational minds victorious. But as the fire dwindled to glowing embers, the mood curdled. The air temperature did not just drop, it plummeted with chilling swiftness, drawing every calorie of heat from their bodies. The silence that had merely been noticeable before now became a palpable weight, pressing down on their chests. The sounds of the night, the rustles, the distant hoots, did not exist. The only sound was the shallow, rapid breathing of the four men. It was the sound of a living creature waiting to be hunted. Elias felt the change, too, a cold prickle of unease that he quickly dismissed as the predictable psychological response to extreme cold and sensory deprivation. Yet, even as he reached for his thermal blanket, he couldn't shake the sensation that the silence had not just fallen, it had been imposed. The logical part of his brain screamed for more wood. The fire was their only sanctuary, their last visual tether to the civilized world. He stood up, grabbing the lantern and an axe. "Need more fuel," he announced, his voice sounding too loud, too brittle. "I'll be quick." Dean nodded, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond the flickering light. "Stay close, man. Don't go deep." Elias gave a dismissive wave. He needed to reassert control, both over the situation and over his own accelerating pulse. He walked into the darkness, the beam of his lantern cutting a weak, bobbing cone of yellow light through the oppressive gloom. Every shadow seemed to coalesce and writhe. The moss-covered trees loomed like skeletal giants, and the soft, marshy ground beneath his boots felt less like earth and more like the diaphragm of some colossal, slumbering beast. He moved further than he intended, his desire to prove his fearlessness overriding common sense. He rounded a cluster of huge cypress trees, the roots thick and exposed like petrified tentacles, and stopped dead. The cold hit him again, not as a temperature drop, but as a physical pressure. It was a vacuum of sensation, the kind of cold that seemed to originate not from the environment, but from the violation of natural law. The air tasted of ozone and ancient peat. Then he saw it. It stood easily 12 feet tall, a grotesque caricature of the human form, rendered in the hellish geometry of nightmare. The Mire-Shade. Its body was skeletal yet massive, sculpted from solidified mud and obsidian-colored flesh that seemed to absorb all light. Its limbs were elongated and thin, ending in wickedly sharp, needle-like fingers. Where a neck should have been, there was only a series of twisted, interlocking roots and wet moss, anchoring a head that was turned completely backward, facing away from him. Elias's mind, trained only for observable reality, struggled to compute. It was impossible, an optical illusion, a severe break from reality induced by stress. But the sight of the Mire-Shade's face, or rather, the lack of one, forced the truth upon him. The head was dominated by a cavernous mouth that extended from chin to crown, ripped open, not a natural orifice but a surgically precise, terrifying rent in the bone. It was not a mouth for eating, it was a mechanism. A biological weapon. A perpetually distended horn of flesh, lined with gums the color of old blood and teeth like broken fragments of shale. The thing turned, not its head, but its entire body, pivoting with a terrifying slowness. Elias was trapped by the lantern's beam, frozen in the cold spotlight of its attention. Where eyes should have been, two pulsing cavities glowed with a malevolent, faint red light, the color of dying embers soaked in oil. A low, grating noise began to emit from the Mire-Shade's throat. It was not a growl, but a sound like massive stones being slowly, inexorably crushed. The creature was inhaling, preparing. Elias dropped the axe and instinctively clamped his hands over his ears, but he knew, somehow, that this sound would not be stopped by physical barriers. He watched, paralyzed, as the Mire-Shade arched its back, its rooted hair swaying like weeping willow branches in an invisible wind, and the terrifying maw widened to its fullest, unnatural extent. Then came the sound. It was not merely loud, it was an annihilation of sound, a frequency that did not travel through the air but seemed to originate simultaneously within Elias's skull and the very ground beneath his feet. It was the sound of 1,000 people screaming, compressed, amplified, and given a physical form. It was pain rendered audible. The world shattered. Elias felt the vibration pass through his body like a high-voltage electrical current. His teeth jarred. The air was violently compressed, knocking the breath from his lungs. His eyeballs felt as though they were attempting to exit their sockets. A hot, metallic trickle ran from his ears. The capillaries had burst. He tasted blood and bile. The sound attacked the idea of hearing. It was beyond comprehension, tearing at the fabric of his sanity. He saw flashes of white and black, and for one agonizing moment, he felt his consciousness detach, observing the raw, physical agony inflicted by the sound waves that seemed to be vibrating the very structure of his DNA. As abruptly as it began, it stopped. Silence rushed back in, but it was not the quiet of nature. It was the deafening aftershock of an explosion. Elias staggered backward, dropping the lantern, which sputtered and died in the mud. He was on his hands and knees, retching, his vision swimming with phosphenes and tears. He scrambled blindly back toward the distant, weak glow of the campfire, driven by a primal need for human contact. He didn't dare look back. He ran until his lungs burned and his injured ears screamed with phantom noises. He burst back into the meager light of the clearing, collapsing near the remnants of the fire. Marcus and Dean rushed toward him, followed by a pale, concerned Noah. "Elias! What the hell happened to you?" Marcus demanded, grabbing his shoulder. "You're bleeding. Is it an animal? Did something scratch you?" Elias struggled to breathe, pointing toward the darkness, his words coming out as choked, wet gasps. The Mire-Shade. It's here. It was right there. Didn't you hear it? The shriek." Dean exchanged a bewildered, frightened glance with Marcus. Noah only looked at the ground. "Hear what, man?" Dean asked, his voice laced with confusion, not mockery. "We heard you trip, maybe a branch break, but that's it. We were starting to worry you'd wandered off." The words landed on Elias with the force of a physical blow, heavier than the monster's shriek itself. "The scream," Elias whispered, clutching his throbbing head. "The sound. It was the loudest thing I have ever. It vibrated the ground. It felt like my head was going to explode." Marcus frowned, genuinely concerned now, mistaking the horror for neurological trauma. "Buddy, you're in shock. Take a breath. We didn't hear a thing. Not a sound louder than the fire." Elias looked from face to face. Their expressions were not of deceit or fear, but of puzzled worry. They hadn't heard it. The realization crashed into the ruins of his scientific mind, completing the devastation. The Mire-Shade's attack had not been a physical sound wave in the normal spectrum. It had been targeted, a spiritual or psychological assault aimed exclusively at the one who denied its existence. The Mire-Shade was real. And it had found a way to bypass every rational defense Elias Thorne possessed, assaulting the core of his consciousness with a weapon only he could perceive. His scientific methodology had been utterly invalidated, not by an observable phenomenon, but by a targeted, selective terror. He was not bleeding from an external injury. He was bleeding from a rupture in his own reality. Elias was left gripping the dirt, tears mixing with the blood on his face, understanding the most terrible truth. The thing had just introduced itself, and only he had received the memo. The immediate aftermath was a confusing scramble to maintain some semblance of order in a world that had just fundamentally inverted itself. Elias stumbled back toward the light, still clutching his head, blood dried to a dark crust around his ears. He tried desperately to construct a post hoc rationalization. Infrasound. Auditory hallucination due to extreme stress. A previously undocumented psychological phenomenon triggered by the Mire's unique atmospheric conditions. He lectured, his voice shaky and high-pitched, relying on the vocabulary of physics like a superstitious man clutching a rosary. "It must be a very low-frequency emission, infrasound. It's known to cause feelings of panic, distress, and induce visual artifacts. The Mire is acting like a resonator, perhaps amplifying tectonic shifts." Marcus cut him off, his face etched with impatient disbelief. "Elias, stop. If you were hit by infrasound strong enough to make your ears bleed, we would all feel the pressure difference. You're spinning out. You saw an animal, you panicked, and you hit your head." Dean, slightly more sober now, chimed in with mocking sympathy. The great Elias Thorne, reduced to a trembling mess by a phantom bear. "Your hypothesis has been disproven, Professor." Noah, however, remained silent, huddled closer to the dying fire. He kept his eyes fixed on the tree line where Elias had vanished, his silence radiating a cold, profound terror that offered Elias no comfort, only confirmation. Noah's fear was intuitive, and in this cursed place, intuition was proving to be a far more reliable instrument than any of Elias's sensors. Elias realized his attempts to normalize the experience were failing. He had seen the creature. He had felt the physical impact of a sound that defied physics. He was utterly isolated in his terror. He tried to point out the small, dark droplets of blood on the ground near the cabin, physical proof of his trauma, but Dean merely said he must have scratched himself on a branch. As the argument died down, something infinitely worse than the shouting took hold: the silence. It was not the immediate, explosive silence following the shriek. This was a measured, heavy quiet. It felt deliberate, like the cessation of movement when a predator realizes its prey is cornered and simply waits. The small sounds of the campfire, the residual crackle, the soft hiss of sap, seemed insultingly loud, ephemeral distractions against the vast, dark emptiness that pressed in from the swamp. Elias grabbed a flashlight, ignoring his previous conviction, and shone it wildly into the trees. Nothing. But he felt the weight of perception upon them, the cold, red eyes fixed on their pathetic huddle. He lowered the light, and that's when he heard it, a sound that was clearly, undeniably external this time. It was a wet, low-frequency sound, a vibration more than a noise. RRNNNHH. It was the sound of something large dragging itself through the mud and thick undergrowth, a rhythmic, guttural moan of deep, mechanical hunger. It was closer than before, far closer, and it was no longer restricting its presence to Elias's internal monologue. "Did you hear that?" Elias whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Marcus, who had been angrily stoking the fire, paused. His face went instantly pale. "Hear what?" "That dragging sound," Elias insisted. "It's moving. It's circling us." Marcus listened, straining. The air was deathly still. "No, man. You're jumpy. It's just the wind." "There is no wind," Elias snapped. "It's suffocatingly still." *RRNNHH. *RRNNHH*. The sound came again, this time distinct, accompanied by the snapping of a thick, dry branch, a clear sign of immense weight moving with sudden, unnatural purpose. This time Dean heard it. His eyes darted toward the sound, located roughly at the back wall of the cabin. His attempt at bravado evaporated, replaced by raw, involuntary dread. "That wasn't wind," Dean choked out, his voice barely audible. "That was heavy." They all stared toward the back of the cabin. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop another 10 degrees, the heat from the fire completely negated. The predatory noise stopped. The subsequent silence was absolute, a perfect vacuum of sound that screamed of coiled menace. They were no longer arguing about whether the monster existed. They were waiting for it to decide how to kill them. The waiting lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though to the four men, it stretched into an eternity defined only by the desperate scramble of their own thoughts. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a realization that all his data, all his learning, was less useful than a piece of dry tinder. He was a sheep who had just proven the shepherd was a monster. Then, the world outside the cabin wall erupted. It was not a subtle approach. There was a sound like a wet cannonball slamming into the rotting wood. The entire cabin shook violently, sending debris raining down from the ceiling. A cloud of ancient dust filled the air. Marcus screamed, a thin, pathetic sound of pure panic, and scrambled backward, knocking over the lantern. Darkness rushed back, thick and absolute, broken only by the meager, dying glow of the embers. They heard the tearing. The ancient wood of the wall, already compromised by time and moisture, gave way with a sickening, splintering crunch. A massive, black hand, skeletal, elongated, tipped with talons like shards of black flint, ripped open a section of the wall beside the single, small window. The creature's red eyes, twin fires of hate and vengeance, appeared in the hole, staring directly at them. The Mire-Shade had arrived. It was even more terrifying in the confines of the clearing, its impossible height magnified by the darkness. Its obsidian skin glistened with dampness, and the stench of swamp decay, death, and something acridly spiritual filled the small space. Elias's mind registered the detail with horrifying clarity, the inverse head, the stretched, trumpet-like maw. He scrambled backward, but the creature wasn't focused on him. It was fixed on Noah, who was nearest the wall, frozen in a silent, absolute terror that made him incapable of even whimpering. The Mire-Shade reached further through the gap, its hand grasping. The talons hooked into Noah's heavy jacket. The creature didn't yank, it pulled with a slow, grinding inevitability that emphasized its total control. Noah finally found his voice, a brief, piercing scream cut short by the brute force dragging him toward the hole. His feet scrabbled uselessly against the dirt floor. "Noah!" Elias roared, leaping forward, but he was too late. The Mire-Shade pulled Noah through the jagged opening, silencing the boy instantly. The sickening sound of wood splintering, followed by a sound that was impossible to categorize, like ripping canvas, but deeper, wetter, and accompanied by Noah's sudden, terminal gargle, signaled the end of the boy's life. Then, the creature turned its attention inward, toward the surviving three. Its grotesque head tilted, the monstrous maw widening toward the open hole. Elias knew what was coming. It was the sound that defied reality, the physical manifestation of agony. The Mire-Shade shrieked again, but this time, it was not aimed at Elias's mind alone. It was aimed at everything. The air inside the small cabin instantly pressurized, becoming thick, viscous, and painful. It felt like being submerged deep underwater while a gigantic bell was struck directly overhead. The sound was a tangible entity, a physical force that struck their bodies like blunt instruments. The cabin structure itself could not withstand it. Glass from the small window instantly pulverized into dust. The rotting wood groaned, shaking itself apart. Dust and debris rained down, but the greatest terror was directed at the remaining body of Noah, still half in and half out of the hole. Elias watched, horrified, as the sound wave hit the boy's body. The shriek did not just kill, it dissolved. The force, the incredible, annihilating frequency, seemed to reject the very cohesion of matter. Noah's skin instantly blistered and shredded, detaching from his muscle in strips. His clothing vaporized around the joints. The shriek was turning his body into a pulverized ruin, a grotesque demonstration of the elemental power of sound. Bone fragments were visible, then instantly pulverized into gray particulate matter. Marcus screamed, clamping his hands over his ears, but the sound was already inside him. He staggered, his nose bleeding freely, stumbling over the collapsed lantern. The shriek continued, an unbroken tide of pure, physical destruction. Elias felt his body screaming in protest, his equilibrium dissolving. He knew they were seconds from disintegration, that the Mire-Shade was proving its legend not with metaphor, but with physics far beyond human understanding. "Run!" Elias somehow managed to project the command through the wall of sound. He shoved Dean violently toward the door, which had thankfully been left ajar. Marcus, half-blinded and choking on his own blood, followed the instinctive movement. The three of them burst out of the cabin and into the black night, their ears ringing with a sound that would never leave them, their minds reduced to a single, panic directive: escape the frequency. Elias, the rational man, was running from the scientific reality that his entire life had been a lie that was now chewing his friends into dust. They abandoned the sanctity of the cabin and ran toward the relative safety of the road, leaving behind the gruesome spectacle of Noah's final, sonic undoing. The metallic tang of fear and blood filled Elias's mouth. His rational mind had fractured completely, replaced by a visceral, animal urge for flight. He didn't think about his instruments, his evidence, or his hypothesis. He thought only of the Mire-Shade's mouth and the sound it held. They reached the SUV, parked 20 feet away. Marcus, driven by pure survival adrenaline, tore open the passenger door. Dean fumbled for the driver's side. "Get in! Get in, move!" Elias screamed, throwing himself into the back seat, collapsing onto the muddy upholstery. Dean jammed the key into the ignition. The engine groaned once, then caught. He slammed the gear shift into reverse, tires spinning wildly in the thick mud of the clearing. The SUV bucked backward, then slammed into forward gear. They tore through the clearing, headlights cutting jaggedly through the darkness. Elias risked a glance out the back window. The Mire-Shade was already emerging from the destroyed cabin, its massive, dark form outlined against the faint embers. It did not run. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a silent, gliding sprint across the wet ground, closing the distance between them at an impossible speed. It was faster than the SUV could manage in the heavy terrain. "Faster, Dean! Go!" Marcus shrieked, leaning over the console. Dean mashed the accelerator. The vehicle fishtailed violently, slamming against a thick tree root, which momentarily jarred the occupants. The Mire-Shade used that moment of hesitation. With a speed that defied its colossal mass, the creature sprang. It covered the remaining distance in a single, terrifying leap. The impact was deafening. The Mire-Shade landed squarely on the roof of the SUV, directly over the front seats. The metal shrieked and buckled under the weight of stone and muscle. The windshield instantly cracked, spider-webbing outward from a central point of pressure. Dean cried out, not in pain, but in sheer, paralyzed disbelief. He lost control of the steering wheel. A sickening sound of rending metal ripped through the roof just inches above Dean's head. The creature was tearing into the vehicle like a child opening a tin can. Dean, momentarily regaining focus, veered violently, attempting to scrape the creature off against a passing tree trunk. It didn't work. Then, one of the Mire-Shade's long, black talons speared down through the heavily fractured windshield. It plunged through the glass and through the upper portion of Dean's skull. The killing was instant, silent, and horrifically brutal. Dean's head snapped back, his body going instantly limp, slamming the accelerator pedal to the floor. The vehicle became an out-of-control, screaming projectile. Blood, hot, bright, arterial blood, exploded backward, coating the dashboard, the windshield, and splattering across Marcus and Elias in the back seat. The SUV careened off the narrow track, headlights swinging wildly, before slamming sideways into the unyielding trunk of a massive oak tree with a final, echoing crunch of twisted metal. Elias was thrown forward, his head slamming against the seat in front of him. For a moment, he was in an underwater silence, the crash having momentarily deafened him to everything but the ringing in his own skull. He coughed, spitting blood and glass, scrambling for the passenger door. He had to get out. The Mire-Shade was still on the roof, dragging Dean's body out of the shattered wreckage. "Marcus! Get out!" Elias yelled, kicking open the twisted door. Marcus, covered in Dean's gore, was already fumbling with his own door. They stumbled out into the oppressive darkness and the freezing air. The Mire-Shade was slowly pulling its prize from the vehicle, but its red eyes were already seeking the next target. They had mere seconds. "We split up!" Marcus yelled, his voice hysterical and shrill. "It can't hunt both of us. I'll go left. You go right. The road is that way." Elias didn't argue. Logic was dead, replaced by the primitive mathematics of probability. 2 chances were better than 1. He plunged instantly into the dense foliage on the right, scrambling down a small embankment, ignoring the pain in his ribs and the wet stickiness on his face. He heard Marcus's frantic, heavy breathing behind him for perhaps 20 seconds. Then, a sudden, sharp, panicked shriek ripped through the air, not the Mire-Shade's monstrous sound, but Marcus's own, human scream of ultimate recognition. It lasted less than 3 seconds before being violently muffled, swallowed by a wet, grinding noise, the same dragging, hunting sound Elias had heard earlier, only now infinitely closer and heavier. Silence descended once more. Elias didn't look back. He didn't dare stop running, not even when the pain in his legs became blinding. He was completely alone now, stripped of his friends, stripped of his rational world, running as a tiny, insignificant morsel through the vast, haunted hunting grounds of a supernatural force of vengeance. He was the last piece of human meat left for the Mire-Shade to consume, and he knew it was already closing the distance. Elias didn't stop running until the thick swamp ground gave way to slightly firmer, higher earth, the edge of the old county boundary road, barely discernible in the darkness. He staggered toward the wreckage of the SUV, still steaming and listing violently, slammed against the ancient oak. His mind was a blank slate of panic, but survival instinct insisted on one thing: the keys. Dean was dead, his body likely being pulverized by the entity, but the engine was his only salvation. He ripped open the driver's side door, pulling Dean's mangled torso away from the seat belt and out of the way. He found the keys still dangling, splattered with gore. He jammed the key back into the ignition, turning it wildly. Asterisk click. Click. Click, asterisk. The starter ground uselessly. The impact had ruptured the battery or crippled the transmission beyond immediate use. Elias cursed, a raw, defeated sound, hammering the steering wheel. He was trapped. The metal coffin was useless. He froze, his head lifted, listening. The sounds of the hunt had